Now, moving on to another issue here. For the first time since the pandemic began, more people want the government to prioritise protecting the economy over limiting the spread of coronavirus. That's according to a new pandemic priorities poll by Kext CNC. Let's take a look. 41% of people now favour protecting the economy versus just 38% who want to prioritise limiting the spread of the virus. That's an enormous drop compared to where things started out in April 2020. Just look at how that graph changes. For those listening on the radio, this is available on GBNews social media. Now, is COVID finally coming to an end, or should we still be cautious about it? Well, joining me now to discuss this is James Johnson, co-founder of JL Partners and senior advisor to Kext Polling. Welcome to the programme. This is a pretty extraordinary poll. I think a lot of people have for some time accepted that the British public has been very cautious when it's come to COVID. Whenever the government's announced a lockdown, they seem to have risen in the polls. Now it might not be the case.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things behind that. I think there's a lot of fatigue going on. This has lasted a long time. Even back in, late 2020, we saw people starting to tire of lockdowns and starting to feel frustrated by them. It's also the vaccine. This has been a big game changer in terms of people's own sense of their personal risk, so that they therefore feel that they can look at other things and prioritise them a little bit more. And it's also about what's going on in the news and going on in people's lives. We've got a huge cost of living crisis going on. We've got the war in Ukraine. When I ask people in focus groups now, what's the biggest issue facing the country? Or, how do you feel things are going at the moment? Very rarely does COVID come up. And I think you see that reflected in those figures.
It's remarkable because whenever the government has taken an easing step or moved to abolish certain restrictions, it has seemed to be unpopular in polling, particularly removing the requirement to self-isolate upon testing positive. That was wildly unpopular. Might the needle now have moved even on that issue?
Yeah, I think it does. And actually, if you look through, and actually that graph you showed there, when it changes, it tends to change after the government brings something in. So the government eases restrictions, whether that was in May 2020 when they first reopened after the first wave, or whether it was in recent changes. And when they loosen up first, the public say, oh, no, we don't like that. We're quite worried about that. But actually, about 3 or 4 weeks after it happens, support then swings behind it. So you see a situation throughout this pandemic, whether it's been closing or easing, that actually the public tend to follow where the government leads them. But I do think now that we're in a very different situation where if the government were to bring in any more restrictions, were to tighten things up again, I think we would see real resistance to that from the public, just as we saw actually in December and January with that Omicron wave. Lots of mutterings about whether there was going to be more restrictions, but actually under the surface of the polls, when you did those focus groups, when you talked to voters face-to-face, very much a sense of wanting to move on from it. So I think something has decisively shifted in that regard now, notwithstanding, of course, a major game changer or a new variant or something that shook that up. But as we are now, I think we'll see that picture continue to trend upwards.
And how